So Liam, where do we stand with material design right now? We've had a couple of years. I mean, has it been 2 or 3 years at this point? We're very comfortable with it.
2014?
Is it 2014?
Yeah, it's been almost 3 years.
Almost 3. Wow, that's crazy. I remember
it's hard
when
to
that
believe.
first hit. Yeah, no kidding. So what is the current state of material design? I feel like every once in a while we see kind of a refresh or additions to the spec. From your perspective, because you work obviously with this a lot, how do you think things are going with the spec? Do you think, is there any glaring, glaring element that you don't like, direction that you don't like? How are things going?
I think that the spec is doing well. I think it's progressing at a good pace. I think that if you know what you're looking at and understand like how to use a design guideline, then it's a really brilliant document. But I think that sometimes it can be a bit opaque in terms of like what areas are open to interpretation versus which ones are more important to the core of the platform, if that makes sense. And I guess the other thing that I would add is I wish that there were more links to developer documentation for a lot of things.
How do you mean there? Like it gives you the basic information and then it's open to, I don't know, people end up interpreting because it's not linked properly? Or like what is the downside there?
In terms of interpretation, I would say that there are certain parts of the spec that have to do with very low-level ways that people use things, like human interaction with the hardware and just platform basics, like things like button styles and stuff that shouldn't really be changed that much. Mm-hmm. But then there are other like more broad strokes, things like navigation patterns and onboarding and things like that maybe are open to a bit more interpretation as far as how you want to use that for your specific product or express that, etc. So I think that sometimes those differences can be unclear to people.
That makes sense.
Yeah. One thing that I've noticed over the course of the 3 years is, okay, so you've got the spec to kind of unify the design of the platform. Some people obviously follow it to a T, so their app literally looks like all other apps that also follow it to a T.
Which I appreciate when they do that, by the way.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, but at a certain point, when is that just too plain, too vanilla? I mean, I appreciate that there are rules and standards in there, but after a while, with being 3 years in, there's a whole slew of apps that all look exactly alike. It's just they have a different function
or color scheme.
Right.
Is there a risk there?
So that's where you have to differentiate between like platform convention and like the unique expression of your own app.
Right.
So things like just the personality. So things like branding and how you want to express things. And that's an important piece.
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine for like independent developers who are, who don't have as much of a team surrounding them for creating apps, it's a lot harder to think of going in the same direction as like a big app, like Dropbox might be a prime example with their new hire here. If they were to redesign their app for Android differently from other platforms and maybe adhere closer to the material design spec, they already have their history, their design language from their app and the history of their app in general to kind of infuse it with and mix it with so that it still retains its personality, but also appeals to the kind of standards of the platform. Let's say an independent developer doesn't have a lot of those resources, so the easiest and probably the most logical place for that person to go, at least right out of the gate, is to adhere to it specifically because that's better than not, I would imagine.
Right.
Yeah. So you listed a few things as we were kind of getting ready for the show as far as topics that were interesting for you that you wanted to cover. One of those things was material components. Explain that a little bit. What is that?
So Google published a project on Dropbox called Material Components, which is basically a collection of repos for material components that you can use on web and Android and iOS, which is cool. So I think it just represents, like I was just complaining that there's not enough developer documentation linked to in the material spec, but this is, I think that this, along with Material Motion, which is another collection that Google has published, which I believe is open source as well, represent them getting more into the tooling of material design and trying to help developers like feasibly implement these things and then share that with other developers, which I think is cool.
Interesting.
How
layouts.
How complicated is it for a developer to kind of follow? I feel like I mean there's the basic spec of material design, which is I have to imagine relatively easy to follow because I see a lot of apps that follow it pretty closely. But then it's starting to get a lot more complex with these components. You also mentioned prior to the show something about stage and gallery tools. Like there's a whole world here that, because I'm not a designer, I'm not super familiar with. Is it a complex world, kind of following this stuff and following all the developments of this now 3 years in?
Kind of. I think it's a lot easier than it used to be. I mean, part of my job as a designer is to understand the platform limitations and kind of how technically feasible some of this stuff is going to be. So I've definitely sent Franco animations before that he's just like, no way this is happening, at least not like at 60 frames per second. So I think that motion is still pretty hard. But, when material design first came out and the spec was first released, things like the nav drawer, that there was no navigation view, there was no floating action button, I think. So a lot of this stuff developers kind of had to make themselves, and then it eventually got added into the support library. So it's come a really long way in terms of actually implementing a lot of these components. But I think that things like motion, because it sets the groundwork for kind of the principles of material motion, and then designers like me like go crazy with that and want to invent all kinds of cool stuff. It's harder to kind of, I guess, predict that and build the things that designers might come up with in a way that makes sense the way that the support library does. So I think that's still a challenge.
I wonder if this is going to be like, pardon me, I'm trying to think. I wonder if this is going to be like Web 2.0. You know what I mean? Remember when it was like,
all bubbly and
yes.
with the shine.
Yes, Ron knows what I'm talking about.
Overly pretty,
like
pretty, maybe,
the aesthetic of
No,
Web 2.0 and how they were like, designing for that, and the startups and the companies that were coming out were designing logos in that manner, blah, blah, blah. So I'm wondering if, the same sort of iteration is going to happen to material design.
That's a good point, because I was in a conversation with some non-tech folks trying to explain material design as a concept, and trying not to explain it in the context of Android, by purely just this is a design construct that doesn't have to be on Android. Right, Liam? Material design exists on the web. You could do it on iOS if you wanted, right?
Yep.
Yeah, and so it's really just kind of and Flo, I think you have a point there. It's the look of now, and who knows, in 3 years from now we're going to look back and be like, oh, remember the material years, But that said, I think that this methodology, at least in terms of seeing how it's applied to specifically to apps and to web design and interactive, kind of interactive design that we've seen, that's what I always look for. Like, when we're in the arena, I always call out that this is a good use of material design, because I think those are the principles that are good for not only looks but also functionality. And so, I guess, Liam, my question to you is, how much of a balance between, when using the framework, is that this looks really good, but this actually allows it to be more functional?
I actually think that material design draws on a lot of classic design principles, which is good. I feel like it has a strong foundation, and its premise of interface in a physical dimension just makes logical sense. So in a lot of cases, if you pay attention to things like typography that material really emphasizes, and the use of color and using elevation to create visual hierarchy and stuff like that, you're going to end up with an interface that's stronger for the user, regardless of, I guess, the aesthetic.
Is there
interesting?
Yeah. Is there any concern or even hesitation in the Android design world about the possibility of the design spec changing the way it did back when Hollow was a thing, and suddenly material comes out of the gate, and everybody has to kind of change what they're doing to fit the new style? Now we're 3 years in. I have to imagine Hollow didn't even exist for 3 years, right, before material design came around, or if it did, it was probably right at that. Do you think we're a ways out from a major shift like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to predict. I don't predict a major change of that scale coming, just because I think that this is such a strong system, and Google has really put a lot of energy behind it, and a lot of leadership and documentation and development and specification. So they've invested like a ton of energy in this. So I don't see them changing to something else just because.
Right. After all of that work, why suddenly upend it and have to start over? Because it's not just about helping designers and developers create cohesive apps. It's about creating the signature of Android is really what it's become.
Which is why it's such a bummer when third-party manufacturers completely
when they mess with
change.
it with their own design language.
I mean, you think about like the manufacturers who try to, stay a little more towards stock, but what they're really doing is just painting the same picture in their own interpretation.
Well, and that's the thing is that it's that interpretation. I mean, like I've seen apps a lot. I've heard anecdotes of companies that are making apps that, in order to work with Google, have to make their app more material designy, and they kind of roll their eyes while they do it. And I don't think that helps anyone. Like I think trying to force an aesthetic is one thing, but to Liam's point, enhancing a better UI and a better visual language, and that's what made material design so hard to describe in an audience of normals, which is like trying to describe the idea of depth and like the button sits on top of the page it's on, but they're like, but it's a flat screen. Like it's like explaining the nuance of that to somebody is I strongly recommend it. If you ever at a party, listen, if you want to be the life of a cocktail party, start talking about material design and see how far that goes. I mean, I'm sure, Liam, it happens to you all the time, right? You're at a bar in Manhattan and you just start talking material, and then people are just enthralled. Yeah.
He's throwing down the material knowledge.
But I mean, it's an interesting. I think it's an interesting exercise to try to explain the methodology behind a really good material app to someone who doesn't quite understand design methodology. That's my point.